I wanted to start with something that one of the panelists on Monday brought up, and that is a quote from Elie Wiesel from his Nobel acceptance speech. And he said, "The memory of evil will serve as a shield against evil." And we're talking specifically about the evil of slavery and how we've, as a nation, failed to remember it in a way that shields us against its evil. And to kind of get into that, I'm going to start by asking Ethan and Blaine to talk about the history of memory with regards to this.
Sure, thank you. I'll start off and then Blaine will pick up. So that's a great quotation, and to get into this topic, I think that the first point I would open with, and something to really keep in mind and underscore, and maybe come back around to your point about fiction and us not having a fiction writer, is that historical memory and memory in general is not the same as history. Sometimes historical memory does reflect what happened in the past. Sometimes it does reflect evidence, facts. But just as often, historical memory is a partial truth about the past. Is myth, is propaganda, is half-truth. Sometimes it's whitewashing or forgetting, and that's certainly the case when it comes to the historical memory of slavery in the United States, at least the dominant memories. And so I think that's critical to keep in mind. And it's certainly critical if we think about the context of what Connor's book is all about, and that is Confederate monuments and the lost cause visions that they perpetuated. The lost cause is a topic I talk about a lot, I teach a lot about, and it can take me a long time to get through this. So I'm going to try to give it as succinctly as I can. The lost cause is a set of Southern arguments and rationalizations that emerge in the aftermath of the Civil War, and it's about the Civil War. It's a way for Southerners to understand this devastating war that they went through, and a way for them to justify all the deaths that happened during the Civil War. And the critical element for them and for the lost cause and the critical mistruth, if you will, about it was revolve around it, the cause of the war, the cause of the Civil War, what brought it on. Ex-Confederates after the war really set out to frame it as a noble cause, a good cause, something worth giving your life for, fighting for. And so, because most of the world by 1865, when the Civil War ended, had rejected the institution of slavery, ex-Confederates, lost causers, argued again and again that the Civil War wasn't about slavery. It was about a host of other better things, more noble things: states' rights, low tariffs or taxes, constitutional liberty, defense of hearth and home, anything that doesn't revolve. It cannot be slavery. That is the critical thing. The key point here, I think, is that this is a lie. This is not true. The historical record shows that. Historians who've studied this show that. And even Confederates before the war make this very clear, that the war was all about slavery. But that doesn't really work for ex-Confederates after the war. And so they come up with this large-scale propaganda campaign. And Confederate monuments, this is where they really come in. They are a part of this campaign. And there are other elements to it. Groups like the United Daughters of the Confederacy put together a textbook campaign where they want to purge any textbook that might associate the Civil War and the Confederacy with slavery. But Confederate monuments are probably the most influential, the most long-lasting of this elements of this propaganda campaign. And I was just looking up numbers before we started, just to give you a sense of this. I wasn't able to find the exact numbers today, because Confederate monuments get pulled down every day, it seems, this summer. So we don't know exactly how many still stand. But according to the Southern Poverty Law Center, did a big study of Confederate monuments, and they've updated it regularly. As of early 2019, there were 780 Confederate statues and monuments standing in this country on public ground. And that's an important distinction. So that leaves out all the monuments that are in cemeteries and private cemeteries, all the monuments in battlefields about a specific battle. 780. So maybe 50 or 60 have been taken down since then. This summer, So that leaves hundreds and hundreds of things, these monuments that are still telling this historical lie, still misrepresenting what happened during the Civil War. And I think Blaine can sort of pick up and frame the second half of what we want to say.
So essentially then you have all of these monuments being put up to commemorate Southerners who fought in the Civil War, Confederates. But the timing of when they were put up is really important. It's critical to understand that they were erected really starting in the 1890s and into the early 1900s. If you're interested in looking at the timeline, there's a really great graph on the Southern Poverty Law Center website. I can hold it up. If you can see there, the kind of this point right here, that shows you the spike in the construction of these monuments. And what's important about that is that the UDC, United Daughters of the Confederacy, and other groups in the South started to put them up as white Southerners were imposing segregation, their Jim Crow regime throughout the South. And so what's important about these monuments is that they really tell us more about that particular moment than they do about the Civil War itself. Because as we know, there were actually a lie about the Civil War. But in many ways, they reveal really fundamental truths about the imposition of segregation. And essentially what white Southerners in these communities were doing was trying to say, we have to reimpose white rule in the South. And the reason I say reimpose is because, of course, right after the Civil War, we did have Reconstruction. And this was the moment, the really revolutionary moment in American history when freed slaves fought for and claimed rights for themselves. The 14th Amendment, they gained citizenship. 15th Amendment, Black men gained the right to vote. And you really had this period in the South where you had really revolutionary, biracial, democratic, small d, democratic governments, state governments, and a real kind of realization of the ideals upon which our nation had been founded. And so this is Reconstruction. And so it was this really bright moment, I think we could say, in American history. But what happens during segregation is that white Southerners say, nope, we're not going to do that anymore. They redeem the South. They reimpose white rule. And so putting up these statues was a way to really inscribe white supremacy in the landscapes of these communities. It was a very visual way of saying white Southerners should be in charge. And we're going to do this by disenfranchising African-American men, by relegating African-Americans to second-class citizenship, all the kind of Jim Crow laws that we're very familiar with. So this was part and parcel of the creation of this new white supremacist regime after Reconstruction. So I think it's really important to understand them that way. And just as like one kind of illustration of that fact, in 1908, there was a Confederate monument that was unveiled in Lexington, Mississippi. There were always people who gave speeches at the dedications of these monuments. And so a Confederate veteran named Wiley Nash gave the dedication speech at this particular monument ceremony. And here's just one little quote from the speech. He said, "These sacred memorials tell in silent but potent language that the white people of the South shall rule and govern the Southern states forever." So really, in a nutshell, that is what these monuments were about.
And I grew up in the South, and these monuments were sort of the water that we all swam in. And in the school book, when we were learning about history, we were told that the Civil War was a war about states' right. And I remember even as an 8-year-old thinking, well, that's not true. But I was surprised, Connor, when I was reading your book, you didn't grow up in the South, but you read the same thing in your history book. And why don't you tell us about that, and also about how you found your way into the reporting that you've done in your book?
Yeah, absolutely. So I grew up in Pennsylvania. The southern border of the county that I grew up in is sort of the Mason-Dixon line. But yeah, growing up, it was the ninth grade student teacher starts the unit on the Civil War saying it was fought about states' rights. And I think one of the things I discovered in reporting this book is that the North has incentive to, participate in this magical thinking about the history of the Civil War and the consequence of that history. The North being just as invested in slave labor, developing instruments of capitalism to extract and hoard that the wealth from that labor. Robert Penn Warren calls it the treasury of virtue. The Northerners sense that because they're affiliated with the Union, they can somehow be exempt from this history. And so a lot of the sort of personal trajectory for me in working on this book was understanding the consequences of Civil War history for me, a Northerner, and also the ways in which race and white supremacy have shaped my life just as much, even if it's convenient or easy to feel separated from it. Mm-hmm. And really, I came to it in a somewhat strange way. It's really nice to have this book out now. I've been working on it for 5 years now. Mm-hmm. And it starts back in March of 2015. I was in Selma on the 50th anniversary of Bloody Sunday. That's the attack by Alabama law enforcement on nonviolent protesters advocating for voting rights, the late John Lewis among them. President Obama was in town to celebrate the 50th anniversary. And it was really easy, especially as, good white liberal Northerner, to think about that day in terms of optimism, in terms of progress, in terms of a feeling as if we have sort of transcended our history, or, because the Edmund Pettus Bridge is so prominent there as a symbol, that we had sort of crossed over. Convenient, but, again, one of these lies that we sort of tell ourselves. So President Obama was there as this day of triumph. 40,000 other people show up too. And Selma's a pretty small city. And so parking, of course, is a nightmare. So I pull into the cemetery. Selma's one of these southern cities. Think, Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil, magnolia trees, Spanish moss, roads that bisect the cemetery. And I think, okay, maybe I can find a sort of out of the way parking spot there. And I ended up finding way more than I bargained for. I had this encounter with a neo-Confederate group there who had sort of staked out their cemetery, or their section of the cemetery. There's a Confederate part of that cemetery. The group that calls themselves the Friends of Forest. And they had said, Confederate Memorial Circle closed for the day, and a bunch of people with scowls on their face. And, that's, if you're there to report on this day, it's like, oh, okay, that's exactly where I need to go. So I wander over and I get into this long conversation with them, and come to learn that this group had spent really the better part of 2 decades fighting about a statue of Nathan Bedford Forrest. And, it would be controversial to put up a monument of a slave trader, an accused war criminal, the first Grand Wizard of the Klan. It would be controversial to do that anywhere. But you do it in Selma, the city that's synonymous with Black voting rights. That just compounds the injury. But they actually put it up the week after the city had elected its first Black mayor. And so it was this real flashpoint. That statue was eventually stolen, but that only kicked off more controversy about whether they could replace it or not. And by the time I met them in 2015, they had just won a lawsuit that was going to allow them to replace that statue. And so they were out there that day to, prepare the grounds, as it were, for that rededication. And the dissonance, the juxtaposition of having this encounter with neo-Confederates on a day of civil rights anniversary was just whiplash inducing. And so I became obsessed with Forrest, who was otherwise, a sort of historical footnote to me. And I was asking myself questions about what it meant to put up a monument to him, to do it in 2015, which they ended up doing a few weeks later. And it was, I thought it might be an essay, a sort of side project I might work on. And then Dylann Roof murders 9 parishioners of Mother Emanuel in Charleston, South Carolina. Images from his blog are released soon after that show that he had made this sightseeing tour of Confederate and monuments and slave cabins, and he had sort of taken this toward almost sort of steel himself for the act of terrorism that he would go and commit. And so in the aftermath of that, protests of Confederate monuments break out across the country. Bree scales the flagpole at outside of the Capitol in South Carolina, and so I decide that as these protests break out to try and remove Confederate monuments, I was going to follow those aimed at Forrest specifically, and he's an interesting figure to study. He's really stands in contrast to someone like Robert E. Lee, who represents the Southern gentleman who went to West Point. Forrest didn't go to West Point, hardly went to school at all. Is seen as this sort of natural man, as one of his biographers call him. He entered the war as a private and was the most promoted soldier of the war, North or South. But because he wasn't given the opportunities to distinguish himself in the Confederacy sooner, a lot of people increasingly over the course of the 20th century have come to see him as the sort of great white hope, what could have been. The South might have won the war if only they had promoted Forrest sooner. So he's the sort of Monday morning quarterback icon for neo-Confederates. So starting in the summer of 2015, I'm starting to follow some of these stories, 4 cities, 4 different monuments, 4 power struggles over race and memory. And one of the stories that I followed was a campaign at Middle Tennessee State University where a building on campus is named after Forrest. And one of the organizers of the protest was Joshua Crutchfield, who's, of course, here tonight.
Yeah, so I guess I should talk about the campaign a little bit. So yeah, I was a graduate student at MTSU during the time, and Bree Newsom-Bass is responsible for organizing that campaign. I just want to point out that so many Black women are responsible for leading our movements, and I, like so many other folks, watch. I was on my Twitter feed and I watched her climb the pole. I watched her come down and quote the scripture. I watched her get arrested, and it inspired me and so many other folks. After I saw that, I posted a Facebook status and I was like, hey, MTSU, we also have a racist, that has a building on our campus. And from that Facebook status, we started building a campaign. I was during the summer. So the campaign started as a group of kind of mostly white students, local community members, and we had some campus unions involved as well too. And kind of from the beginning, our argument was pretty simple. It was, if you care about Black people, you care about your Black students, your faculty, your staff, the area's Black community, you rename Forrest Hall, just given the history of Forrest. And the backdrop also is this is all going on also. You had the Dillon Roof, but you also had an ongoing movement for Black Lives that was also kind of happening in the backdrop. And I was connected to kind of the organizing in my local community as well too. So we connected, our statements with the ongoing movement for Black Lives, and also the long history of students that have been organizing to get rid of white supremacy iconography on our own campus. MTSU was like a lot of other schools, Southern schools who embrace Confederate iconography, especially after once Black students came to campus, and especially after the Brown versus Board decision. And so following that decision, MTSU officially named their building, the ROTC building, Nathan Bedford Forrest. And since Black students had arrived on MTSU's campus, they've been protesting these symbols. They've been protesting the Confederate iconography. MTSU has now archived these protests, and you can see just from those archives that Black students in the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, the 2000s, and the 2015s have been protesting how this iconography made Black students on the campus feel. So we held an action to kind of highlight that this was happening on our campus. And after that first action, we had we made a fake Forrest and we buried him in a casket, which kind of symbolized that we needed to bury Forrest. And as a response to that, the president came out and met us, and they created a task force to debate whether they wanted to change the name. And as an aside, task forces are tools. There are tools that institutions use to stymie momentum. It's a special white supremacist tool that prevents any, real changes around white supremacy and any other forms of domination. In our minds, the school was trying to debate white supremacy. And we thought that by participating in it, we would legitimize an illegitimate process. We were like, what is there left to debate at this point? But the task force, they announced that they would have three public forums to debate the issue. At the first meeting, we planned and we joined some other undergraduates who were also organizing under this. These undergraduates were mostly Black undergraduates, and we began coordinating our responses. But the forums were a mess, right? But we used them as an opportunity to kind of show our dissatisfaction. So at the first forum, we coordinated our own speakers. We delivered our message. At the end of the forum, we kind of interrupted the end of it, reciting the Assata chant. If you've heard of the Assata chant, it's a chant that's used after a lot of kind of BLM, moving for Black Lives related actions. At the second forum, we interrupted it, protesting its legitimacy, and we were escorted out by the police. At the third forum, or before the third forum, I published a letter to the editor of our local paper, basically suggesting that Black students should leave MTSU and transfer to HBCU. And my reasoning was that basically students shouldn't have to be begged to be included, and people shouldn't have to be begged to be included in things. And at what point is begging diminishing our own selves? And I was also just wondering kind of out loud if this was really Black work, if this is the work that I should be kind of committing myself to. But they held a third forum, and after that, the students marched to the president's house. And so we try to just make dramatic points throughout these forums. After this, the task force decided to recommend a name change. That recommendation was then debated at the State Historical Commission, and they decided not to change the name. And so for me, this was really just lessons that I was learning, right? It left me convinced, one, that this type of work wasn't worth my particular energy. Like this is important work to be done, but it wasn't worth my energy. I saw students, mostly like Black students, really were here to get our education, right? But they were going to forums, getting called niggers, they were getting called dumb, they were getting all these things were happening to them, their mental health was suffering. And then, I was questioning the ability for symbolic gestures to make any material impact in our lives. I don't see it the same way necessarily right now. I do think, we wage struggle in the symbolic and the material, and the symbolic holds weight in our lives. But I think for monuments, for me, and we can talk about this later, what's the future of monuments? I would like to see, if we do have monuments, for those to reflect a kind of collective struggle, right? We love MLK in our country, but MLK was not the movement, right? And he has a monument in DC, but he was not the movement. If we do have monuments in society, I want them to be dedicated to collective movements of people, who have, tried to make our world a better place. And so those are my lessons from the campaign for us all.
And just to be clear, the building is still named after Forrest.
Yeah, one thing I didn't mention that we mentioned a little bit earlier was that, the task force that MTSU created, one of the people that they assigned to the task force was a co-sponsor of the bill in Tennessee that makes it more difficult to remove names off of buildings. And so this is how the system works, right? This is how it's designed to operate. So yeah, it's still named for us all.
Great. And Bree, could you tell us how you came to kind of marry your art and activism together, and what was behind this moment that has inspired so many people around the world at this point?
Sure, certainly. So, just some brief, more background on me. My family's from South Carolina, from the Carolinas. My mother's family's from South Carolina. My father's family's from North Carolina. And really, it's only been on my father's side of the family, it's really been my parents' generation. On my mother's side of the family, really my grandmother's generation that really moved away from the places that they had been enslaved. So in South Carolina, I can go to where for instance, like my third great grandfather's headstone is, you know, and he's like buried not far from the plantation where he was enslaved. So that was just kind of a history I grew up with. And it was something that I didn't even fully appreciate until I was like, you know, really grown and like, you know, really forming an analysis around everything that I had kind of like seen and experienced up to that point, you know, growing up with my grandmother, having her talk about her experiences of racism, you know, in South Carolina. Of course, the flag was always there. That was just a thing that we all knew about. You know, we would see that flag there. In the case of the flag in South Carolina, that was raised in the 60s. And I'm sure like, you know, the historians on here can kind of speak to that. There have been like these different waves of like, you know, the erection of Confederate, you know, symbols. But that one was raised in the 60s, you know, clearly as a statement of opposition to the civil rights movement, came right on the heels of the sit-in movement and the Friendship 9 demonstration there in South Carolina. So that was the thing we knew about. We all knew what it represented. You know, it was originally placed over the dome of the Capitol. I remember vividly in the year 2000, I think I was in middle school at that point when they moved the flag from the dome to the lawn, you know, put it on the flagpole. And at that point, they passed the law that it couldn't be lowered for any reason unless there was a 2/3 approval in the state house. So, you know, just further kind of like enshrining this law of protection around the flag. And it had always been a point of controversy. You know, NAACP had led a boycott over the issue, you know, in the state. NCAA wouldn't host championship games there. So, you know, one of the misconceptions from a lot of people, particularly outside of the region, was that the flag just became a point of controversy, you know, in the aftermath of Charleston. And of course, it was always, you know, this point of controversy. And so then, of course, when everything happened in Charleston with the shootings, I think for me, for a lot of folks at that point in time, I was in Charlotte, which is just an hour north of Columbia. I mean, all of that is really kind of like the same region in a lot of ways, like upper South Carolina, lower North Carolina. What was so particularly offensive about that whole situation was it just kind of encapsulated everything we had been talking about the disregard for Black life. So instead of the conversation, you know, in the aftermath, first of all, a lot of the focus in the aftermath of Charleston was how are Black people going to react? You know, I mean, I remember watching like the immediate, you know, breaking news in the aftermath and reporters asking, you know, Black community members who are standing around, are you going to riot? Are you going to be violent? And it's like, we're not the ones being violent. Like there's this nonstop violence that is being enacted, you know, upon us. And so for the focus in the aftermath to not be on a conversation about like, how did Dylann Roof come to be? How did you come to have this, you know, young white guy in his 20s raised in Columbia, South Carolina, in the shadow of that flag, form this racist ideology? And you know, the people who have been primarily engaging in historical revisionism have been the state leadership, right? It's been like Nikki Haley, who's kind of like been rewriting the history. Dylann Roof, you know, as you were mentioning, he went around and did like a historical tour before he did this. He was operating obviously in a white supremacist ideology, but he was operating with an accurate history of white supremacy, right? Like he's not the one that is engaging a revisionist history around the symbolism of the Confederate flag. So instead of us discussing like how does that come to be shaped? How does that mind come to be shaped? You know, my goodness, what's going on in South Carolina that this has happened in Charleston? Instead of talking about that, we're talking about the flag and why we can't even lower the flag, right? That's where all of the energy and attention is going. They lowered, you know, the American flag to half-staff when it was over the state capitol, but not the Confederate flag. And then they're pointing to this law that they had passed in, you know, the year 2000 as the reason why. And so it just again kind of showed how Black life continues to be equated to property, like white property and state property, and often equated as less than when those two things are put up against each other. And so one, I don't believe, and I mean, there was a team of folks that I was working with when we did this. Sometimes, you know, people think that I just hopped up, you know, one day and didn't know. You know, I was have been participating in Black Lives Matter movement and, you know, organizing there in, you know, North Carolina for a couple of years at that point. And I came together with like the people I had been organizing with and we discussed it. And I still don't believe that South Carolina would have lowered that flag had we not done the action that we did to apply that extra kind of like social and political pressure on them. But I mean, one of the things that we discussed was that we didn't want to wait for South Carolina, like to just leave it as though this is just something for the state legislature to go through its process and, and decide whether or not we are worthy of dignity. The whole display of processing Clementa Pinckney's casket through the street. He was the pastor at Emmanuel AME and was also a state senator. They're processing his casket through the streets, and just this visual of, the Confederate flag, symbolically flying above the American flag and the state flags at that point in time. We just felt like that was the kind of situation that like epitomizes why we do civil disobedience, kind of in that tradition of civil disobedience to demonstrate the injustice of the law. Because the flag was again on state property, held and protected by state law, raised at a time when we didn't even have, voting rights, for the most part. So this was a decision that was not made with the full participation of everybody in the state. And so it was exactly what it has always been, just this symbol of white supremacy, just this symbol that, white rule continues to be the rule of the day. And so it was really just a logistical reason at first, like how it came to be that I scaled the pole, because we weren't sure how to take it down. Apart from the legal protections, they had created like physical protections for this flag. So they had like this 4-foot tall spoked fence around it. They designed it with this internal pulley system, so you couldn't just walk up to it and lower the flag. And so that's how it, came to be the method that somebody would scale. But knowing that, then it was like, okay, how can we use this moment to create an image, create not necessarily a symbol. It has become kind of a symbol, but really in that time, we were thinking more of like just an image of rebellion, of revolution, of defiance, of not just white supremacy, but also terrorism, so like, whereas in Charleston, you had this instance of somebody going into a church, shooting, primarily unarmed and elderly people during a prayer meeting. Here I am scaling the pole in, full daylight, kind of like unafraid to be arrested, just kind of like demonstrating this defiance of terrorism and fear. And of course, we recognize like that would be powerful to see a Black woman, doing that role. Apart from being arrested, we, considered a lot of the dangers that would come with it. But assuming that everything went, as according to plan as it did, I felt comfortable kind of like speaking to that because I had the history to it. I could kind of like speak to the history of why we did it, which is really interesting because, I love the conversation that we're having now. But initially, a lot of the questions were like, well, why did you do that? Like, why is it, necessary to take the flag down? And we also made the decision, because I would need an additional person to help me over the fence and stand guard as I climbed. We made the decision that James Tyson should be the person to do that. He was a white man who was part of the group. We were a multi-ethnic group. But we made that decision because we wanted to demonstrate, one, that, it can't just be on people who have been oppressed to dismantle oppressive systems, right? But then also to symbolize the struggle. So my climbing the pole, apart from just being this logistical thing, it kind of demonstrates or symbolizes this like prolonged struggle to dismantle white supremacist systems. And I think part of what made it a powerful demonstration in that way was it also just showed how ridiculous in a lot of ways the situation was. Like you're saying, we can't take a flag. Yes, you can. And how ridiculous is it that an average citizen is having to like go through all this labor of scaling a pole just to take the damn thing down, And it was also like for me, I was inspired not just by the Confederate monument protests that were going on, but this was global at that time too. You have to remember there was the students in South Africa were toppling, the statue to Cecil Rhodes. So it was just kind of like all of this energy and momentum around, not just toppling like the symbols, but through toppling the symbols, really challenging the ideology. Like on a kind of like deeper level. And through that really like, making a statement about the systems and laws and, and structures that protect these symbols and give them more protection than Black people. That was really all that we were trying to kind of communicate with the whole thing.
And one of the things that's happened since then, especially over the summer, is that the conversation is happening on local levels about whether these things should be taken down or not. And to some extent, the institutions have kind of gotten more involved in these decisions. What do you think? How effective do you think that is going to be? Can institutions dismantle these symbols of white supremacy when institutions are also the ones who typically uphold white supremacy? Or is this something that activists can only do?
I think it has distinct meaning when activists do it and when the state does it. I do think that I do take it as a certain indication of a kind of progress, if that makes sense. Like when the state says, okay, we're going to, the city council comes together and formally, removes a symbol or takes a monument down. I mean, that's significant. However, it does definitely represent the state trying to co-opt like the revolutionary energy, because it's a different kind of energy than when folks just go up and do an act of civil disobedience and topple it. I think it kind of represents the state trying to get on top of things. And we deal with that constantly, where the state is constantly trying to make these adjustments as needed to still maintain the overall system. So, the resolution is, okay, we'll take the monument down. Like in South Carolina, they waited, I think it was like 10 or 14 days. They raised the flag back up after they arrested me. Then they wait a few more days, go through the formal process, have their formal ceremony, and then continue to pat themselves on the back as though structural racism has been resolved in South Carolina. So that's the type of thing I think we have to constantly be on guard and push back against.
So Joshua, did you want to add something to that?
Yeah, I think just tagging along with what Bree was saying, like it's a different critique as well too. When Bree took the flag down, it was a different critique of white supremacy and its attendant, logics. When the state takes it down, they don't see anything wrong with white supremacy necessarily. They see the problem with the flag. They take kind of the symbology connected to it, the ideologies behind it, out of that. They just take a flag down, but like you said, they leave their same structures in place.
Right. So the author Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie has a great TED Talk called "The Danger of a Single Story," and one of the things she says that one could argue that there's a single story about the past as represented by these monuments that's a false story, and one of the things that she calls for is a multitude of stories. And recently, the Mellon Foundation made $250 million available to rethink monuments and memorials. Is one of the answers to this to have more monuments that represent maybe what actually did happen?
Absolutely. I mean, I don't think that's the only thing that needs to be done, and maybe we should be careful about thinking that's going to solve our larger structural problems, or even thinking that we learn our history from monuments to come back to this idea of what historical memory is. But at the same time, these are real. They're in people's face every day. And I do think, folks like the Mellon Foundation, if they are going to put $250 million behind this, I mean, that can go a long way. There have been activists in a lot of communities struggling for decades in many places, certainly Charleston, which we write about, struggling to put up monuments, struggling to get funding for those, getting pushback from the city or local organizations. So to have a significant sum that if local communities can have a voice about what sort of monument is put up, to who or to what, as Joshua suggested, maybe collective actions, not individual actors. I think that can make a real difference. I mean, Charleston was doing that well before they started taking monuments down, which they finally have. They had been putting up monuments to African-American leaders for about 10 years.
Yeah, and probably the most, I think, kind of compelling example of this in Charleston, which again is our particular focus, would be the monument to Denmark Vesey, which went up in 2014. Denmark Vesey had been enslaved. He was able to buy his freedom and then planned a slave rebellion in 1822. The rebellion was foiled. It did not happen. He and others were executed. And it was this really important moment in Charleston's history. And so a lot of Black Charlestonians over the years said, it's time that we have a monument to this Black revolutionary who was so significant to our history. and really struggled, as Ethan suggested, sometimes to get the resources to do it. It's, not a cheap proposition to put up a statue, but of course also had to overcome a lot of local white opposition in Charleston to get this monument up. But when it was finally installed in 2014, I think it's safe to say that it was a pretty big deal in a city that for hundreds of years has really whitewashed its past. And to the extent that it has recognized the history of the institution of slavery, has just cast it as benign. It was this benevolent institution. Everybody was happy. It was fine. The story of Denmark Vesey really punctures that myth, because here's a man who tried to plan a rebellion and ended up dying, in that effort. And so I do think that these types of monuments can be very powerful, even though, of course, as we've been saying, symbolism can be somewhat limited. I think it's worth thinking about not shutting down memorialization altogether, I guess I would say.
Yeah, I think another powerful example of that in the sort of using public space in the project of truth-telling is the Memorial for Peace and Justice in Montgomery, or what's known maybe more colloquially as the lynching memorial. That's a marker for every county in which racial terror lynching took place, from the end of Reconstruction to 1950. And that's an incredibly immersive experience, powerful, troubling, sobering experience. But it's also immersive, and it sort of moves as you move through it. And I think what was powerful for me about visiting it is to encounter that history as a white person. As you're moving through this colonnade of these markers, the floor actually kind of drops out from under you at one point. So you descend, but these markers hold their place. So at a certain point, you're below them looking up as if you were attending one of these lynchings. And I think it's immersive in that way, and asking white visitors to understand themselves in the history of this violence, and that their lives too have been shaped by this history that we've so often turned away from or told lies about to let us off the hook. So I think, there are really powerful ways of building memorials, and immersive ones that are beyond just the sort of, great man vision of history that some of these monuments enshrine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that opened in 2018. Which is just 1 year short of the 400th anniversary of the first enslaved Africans arriving on this continent. So it took a long time for that to come. We're going to run out of time in about 10 minutes, but there's something else that occurred to me, Joshua, when you were talking about how Black women are the organizers usually for these changes, and something, Connor, that I noticed when I was reading your book, and Blaine and Ethan too, is that white women kind of spearheaded these monuments. So there's some gendered things happening here with who's upholding the myth of the lost cause and who's dismantling it. And I wonder if y'all could say more about that.
Sure. So Ethan mentioned earlier the United Daughters of the Confederacy, and those were these white women who were very involved in putting these monuments up throughout the South. I do think that in Charleston, it is significant that as women like that are kind of inscribing what they want in the landscape, African-American women and children significantly are the ones battling what they're doing. And probably the best example in Charleston would be the monument to John C. Calhoun, that until very recently it was in Marion Square. Marion Square is just about a block and a half from Emmanuel AME Church. And white women put up a monument to John C. Calhoun in the 1880s. It's not technically a Confederate monument since he died before the Civil War, but we would call it a Confederate monument.
He's the intellectual godfather.
The intellectual godfather of the Confederacy. He's the one, of course, who's famous for saying that Southern slavery was a positive good. So white women put it up, but Black women and children really led a kind of campaign of vandalism and defacement of this monument as soon as it was put up. It went up in 1887, and if you look through the newspapers in Charleston, you will see news stories about how this monument was covered with paint in the darkness of night, or how a child walked by with a tiny pistol and shot at it. And probably, I think the most powerful memory of what Black women were doing came from Mamie Garvin Fields.
Sure. Yeah, well, Mamie Garvin Fields was a young woman who grows up after this monument, born right around the time the first monument. There were 2 Calhoun monuments. The first one is erected, and she would write about how she and her classmates and friends took it personally. And this is what she said, and she writes in her memoir called Lemon Swamp, that Blacks took that statue personally. As you passed by, here was Calhoun looking you in the face and telling you, "You may not be a slave, but I am back to see you stay in your place." I believe white people were talking to us about Jim Crow through that statue. And so she would document how not only her feelings about it, but how she and her classmates would vandalize it. Vandalize the first monument, they took one down, put a bigger one up, vandalized the second one. And so in many ways, Joshua and Bree are acting in it, as they both suggested, this long tradition. It's not a new tradition to resist these monuments among African-American Southerners and others, but primarily African-American Southerners, and often, as Blaine suggested, women and children.
Mm-hmm. And I was just going to say, I think it's important to recognize, like, I think for as long as Black people have been enslaved, folks have had an understanding and analysis around the relationship between their lives and property. So I mean, this is like the resisting through targeting property has gone on in a lot of different forms and formats, and I think also it's not a coincidence that it's Black women and children that would be vandalizing it, because the system of chattel slavery was like legally organized around the enslavement of Black women and their children. Black men were enslaved because of the status of their mother. I mean, that's kind of how the system would operate. And I think that's why you see things kind of playing out as they are. Yes, we have these gender dynamics, but we have to also recognize that gender was racialized. I mean, it matters what your race is, and that's why we see those politics still playing out today.
I think that our conversation around when these monuments got put up should remind us the connectedness between the Confederacy and America, right? I think we got to connect these conversations a lot more, and we should see like efforts to remove Confederate iconography connected to struggles to defund the police, dismantle police, abolish prisons. I think the fact that we still have prisons points to the unfinished work of abolition, the unfinished work of Reconstruction, the afterlives of slavery. We have to begin, I think, seeing the American flag and the American flag tied together. We got to begin seeing that Confederacy is a legacy of America, and America is a legacy of the Confederacy. The Confederacy didn't become a world power because of slavery. America became a world power because of slavery. They reaped the benefits of slavery. And these conversations sometimes make me a little uneasy, because it makes it easy to say the Confederacy ended and that the problem of the Confederacy is over, when it's not, and it continues to haunt us. And so I just think that, as we move forward, having these conversations always, get us talking about America and the distance between America, what it says it's about, and how it actually treats Black folks, brown folks, queer folks, low-income folks, immigrant folks. I think we need to connect these conversations, because they're connected. We can't talk about Confederates without talking about America.
Yeah, Confederates and Confederate monuments, Confederates were telling a lie that Americans invented, right? That the slavery outlasts the Civil War because the justification for slavery, the lie of white supremacy, was not vanquished at Appomattox, and is perpetuated north and south to this day. So yeah, it's absolutely seeing the Confederacy as an American project that all Americans had an investment in, and that white Americans continue to benefit from because of the hoarding of resources, wealth, opportunity. It lives on.
I think that's maybe one thing we've seen from activists this summer is, there's a clear connection that people have touched on between Dylan Roof and the Confederacy, right? He loved to fly the Confederate flag. There's not as clear a connection between the police officers who murdered George Floyd and other acts of violence in recent years. Not as clear a connection, obvious a connection, but it is a connection to Confederate monuments. And so I think the fact that activists have targeted Confederate monuments this summer highlights their desire to show what you're suggesting, Joshua, that these things are intimately connected, and that we cannot separate them, that we must see our contemporary events and our contemporary injustices is rooted in this long history. And these monuments are a part of that. They're not just removing a nation that for 4 years existed. They're removing a history that we've lived through since our founding.
And they're really reminding people that the sectional reconciliation that happened in the years and decades after the Civil War was at the expense of African Americans, bodies, lives, rights, everything, right? And that's what these protests, I think, have really demonstrated really vividly as well.
And I was just going to say, let's not forget, it's not just Confederate monuments that are being, kind of targeted by activists. I mean, it's monuments to Columbus, it's monuments to conquistadors in Latin America. I mean, it really is for those people who are targeting the monuments, it is about making a statement against white supremacy and colonization.
And that brings up the last kind of lightning round that we have a vice presidential debate that's happening shortly after this ends. And at the presidential debate, of course, Donald Trump refused to denounce white supremacy. And I asked each of you for one action to stand against white supremacy. So Connor, when we start with you.
Yeah, I mean, probably a lot of people are joining us who aren't in the South, and maybe there's not a Confederate monument where they are. But look where the power is, and look where the resources are in your community, and see who has them, who has access to them, and who doesn't, and let that steer you to your next action.
Joshua?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say Louisville. There's a lot been going on in Louisville still, and after Breonna Taylor, more protesters got arrested, right, for this whole thing than the actual perpetrators of it. So I always suggest folks look up the Louisville Community Bail Fund and donate, because people still need to get bailed out.
Great. Bree?
I really encourage people to look at how white supremacy manifests in whatever industry or profession that you're in, because it's in every structure, and to really see how you can help dismantle those structures and practices around you.
Great. And Ethan and Blaine?
I'm going to say mine first in case she steals mine. I would say as a historian and educator that we need to start telling the full truth in our schools from K to whenever. So we never leave school, right? This is education, and we need to start telling the truth.
I think it's time. I think it's long past time, really, to be pretty honest about what has happened to one of the two major political parties in the United States. And, I think that maybe some people have been kind of loath to be honest about that, maybe 20 years ago, 15 years ago. But I don't think that we can really not address the fact that white grievance politics is really at the center of the Republican Party. And we need to talk about that to people in our communities and hold them accountable for that.
Thank you all. And this is Connor's book, which you can buy by clicking the link below. It's a great reporting of lots of ways that these dynamics play out around these 4 different statues or memorials to Nathan Bedford Forrest. Follow Bree Newsome Best, follow all the actions that you continue to do. I do think that activists and artists together can make a mark that people can really wake people up. There's no more of, oh, that's just the water that we're swimming in. It's like, no, these things can change, and we can change them. And so, and Denmark VC's Garden, for those of you who are writers, when you said that it's a genealogy of memory, it just, like, as writers, it just perked me up. It's like amazing to think to trace the way that memory functions. And of course, we see the way that that's playing out in our society, and it doesn't have to be that way if we can reckon with the past. And so hopefully you'll all continue to read and continue to have these conversations with the people in your lives, and continue fighting for justice and equality and equity. And you'll come back and join us at Moore Center for Fiction events. And thank you all very much for joining us tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Good to be with you.
Bye.
Thanks.